Good evening. Tonight I'm going to tell you the story about a port, a place, and a ship. Now you might think to yourself, what does she mean by this? Why are we studying a port, a place, and a ship? But I'm interested in this because I'm interested in the products that are in the belly of the ship. And those products are enslaved people. I've been studying enslaved people for my entire career. And one of the things that I'm interested in is their experiences and their lives, their daily lives, their activities. But I'm also interested in how they came to places like the port of Matagorda. The port of Matagorda is in Texas. It's in the southeast corner of the state. And it is a place that the original colony, the Stephen F. Austin colony, founded this region and encouraged colonists to come from all parts of the world as far as Germany and as close as Massachusetts. Individuals came here because there was alluvial soil and lots of land. And they were promised this soil and this land where they can then build their plantations and continue enslaving Africans and African Americans. These are the individuals that I'm interested in. In 1846, a ship by the name of the St. Paul landed at the port of Matagorda. There were 58 individual enslaved people on this ship. We don't know much about how they experienced their journey, but we do know that they traveled about 440 miles from New Orleans into Matagorda. Now, most of the people that talk about slavery, and it's the slave trade in particular, end in New Orleans. New Orleans was the southern base of the trade. It was the capital of the southern part of the trade. And so most people don't really include Texas. They say, oh, well, you know, everything in the deep south, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana.
Please welcome Daina Berry.
And, oh, yeah, Texas, too. Sometimes it's sort of tacked on as an afterthought. But when I moved here about 6 years ago to come teach here at the University of Texas, I wanted to know more about the experience of slavery and those of the enslaved that worked on the plantations here. And what I learned was that there were not only cotton, but there were also sugar plantations here. Texas is one of the biggest producers of sugar during the 19th century. And Matagorda was the second county in the state of Texas to produce sugar. So the enslaved people that got off the St. Paul in 1846 and landed at the port of Matagorda came to plantations in the county and worked along Caney Creek. This was a creek that came all the way down through the county and emptied in the Gulf of Mexico. So in order to understand more about them, I've been teaching classes on the domestic slave trade. And my undergraduate students here at UT, under the auspices of a Humanities media grant, have been working on understanding a mapping of slavery in Texas. How enslaved people came into the state, where they were then transported to, how they lived their lives, what kind of work and labor did they perform. And we've been doing this research for about 2 or 3 years now. But this semester alone, we actually began our mapping project. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about that. So when we look at ships like the St. Paul, and we look at the enslaved people that got off that ship, we started trying to figure out where did they go, what plantations. Well, in 1846, the same year that that ship came into the port of Matagorda, there was an enslaved man by the name of Sam, there was an enslaved man by the name of Sam who was born. He was born in Matagorda, and he worked on a cotton plantation. Also that year, in 1846, the Hawkins family traversed all the way from North Carolina and came and landed in Texas as part of the colony, as coming into the colony. And they came here to establish a plantation, a large both sugar and cotton plantation. We don't know whether or not Sam worked on that plantation. We don't know whether or not Sam was born in that plantation, because enslaved people's records come in scattered bits and pieces. I tell my students we're like detectives of the past. We have to take a fragment here and a fragment there and try to weave it together to tell a story. And we've been able to do that. We've been able to do that by understanding how enslaved people came here and the kind of work that they did. So when the Hawkins family settled in the 1840s, the same year Sam was born, the same year the ship, the St. Paul, landed at the port, we then learned about the lives of the enslaved people, their daily lives, and the type of work that they did on this cotton and sugar estate. So when you think about cotton, right, something that you guys probably are all wearing, we all wear cotton, at least, you know, some of our wardrobe is consisted of cotton. It's the fabric of our lives, right? So I always ask my students, because I think about teaching history from the senses. to touch history, to smell history, to taste it, to see it. So I tell them to pick up a cotton ball. I want you guys to do this when you go home. Pick up a cotton ball, figure out how light it is, bounce it in your hand a little bit. One of the things that's unique to me about cotton, not only that because enslaved people picked it 150 years ago, but it's very, very light. And we have records, very scattered records, but we have records of enslaved people here in Texas that picked cotton. And the average amount of cotton that they picked per day was about 200 to 300 pounds of cotton. That's pretty amazing when you think about how light a cotton ball is, right? So they picked this cotton and they worked from sunup to sundown. They sang songs like "Old cotton, old corn, see you when I'm born. Old cotton, old corn, see you in the morn. Old cotton, old corn, do it till I'm born." In addition to picking cotton and working in the fields, they went to the fields at 4 o'clock in the morning. The horn was rung at 4 o'clock to wake them up, and they were in the fields by 4:45 a.m. That's not a lot of time to get ready for work, right? They got out there and they picked cotton up until the next horn, which was breakfast time, around 8:30 a.m. This was back-breaking labor. They're bending over, picking cotton off the plant, taking it out of the bowl, putting it in a bag on their shoulder, getting down the aisle or the row of cotton that they're working on, and then dumping it into a basket. 200 to 300 pounds a day, every single day. And in the winter, they worked until 7 p.m., and in the summer, they worked until there was daylight, until there was no longer daylight, usually around 9 p.m. But their work didn't stop after they left the fields. They had to cook dinner, they had to prepare their meals, they had to rest and dress wounds, and they had to spend time with their families. We learn a little bit about their experiences in the community, in the quarters, from slave narratives. There were a collection of narratives that were done in the 1930s during the Great Depression, where in order to give jobs to those that were unemployed, they started collecting narratives. The Workers' Progress Administration sent out workers throughout the South to interview individuals that had once been enslaved. These were the last living descendants of those people that we talk about and we can read about today. What's fascinating, though, about their stories is that they were recorded. And because of digital technology, we now can actually listen to their stories and hear them in the classroom. The Library of Congress has digitized these files, upgraded them, and now we can play the tapes as opposed to having the students read, a very flat, sort of one-dimensional white paper, black words. It's different to hear the stories. You hear tone, you hear inflection, and they're always surprised that they don't hear anger. And some of the slaves that we listen to sing songs. They sing songs about their work lives, they sing spirituals, they talk about funerals, they talk about laughter, they talk about dances. They share stories about what they did in those few hours that they had when they weren't working. We could pretty much calculate that enslaved people worked about 12 to 18 hours a day. So very long work days. In the evening when they came back from the fields, oftentimes the women cooked and prepared meals. Men did fishing. They often went in creeks like Caney Creek, which was right outside of the plantation that the Hawkins had and outside of their ranch. And they fished and they brought extra protein for their diet. And they had meals together, sometimes in their cabins, and some estates allowed them to have it for the whole plantation community. So why is this important for the humanities, and why should we care about stories of people over 150 years ago? Well, I would argue, and my students would tell you, that their stories matter today because they produce crops that we still use. They produce the crops that we still use. They produce the sugar that we put in when we bake pies and we make coffee and we make tea. Domino sugar was once made here in Texas, and the large plants were outside of Houston in Sugar Land, Texas, right where the enslaved people that got off the St. Paul, people like Sam, that worked on plantations right here in Texas. We also used, not only did we use mapping technologies, but we also did the narratives, as I mentioned, and we also had to do a number of different research. We researched newspapers, and we read newspapers throughout the state of Texas to try to retrace these stories. And in the newspapers, we learned about the community. We learned about fights that were going on, we learned about court cases and all kinds of different things. The students were fascinated how we put all these stories together like a map, and then we were able to thread it and weave it together and tell the full story. We learned about an unnamed enslaved man who was 30 years old, about 5 feet 11 feet tall, who ran away from his owner in Matagorda. We don't know much else about him, but that few things about his personality, that came in the form of a runaway slave advertisement. Through runaway slave advertisements, newspapers looking at the other articles that are surrounding that advertisement, through plantation journals and records, through maps that we have of the time, we could understand and reconstruct these individuals' lives. One of the other things that we did this semester was we did some training and we learned how to use Google Fusion mapping technology as well as mapping technology called CartoDB. And through that, we then mapped out the routes that the ships took, the travel that people went by land from North Carolina and other parts of the South, or even the North to come to Texas. We mapped out where slaves were sold. We mapped out plantations, mills, courthouses, and so forth. And then we put it all in a visual record. And we now can tell a story that's visual. We can now see their experiences. We can now say, well, the travel from Matagorda to New Orleans is 440 miles. What was that journey like on foot? What was that journey like by boat? What happened when they went and transported the goods up the Caney Creek or the Colorado River on steamboats? What was that experience like? How did they like living on these ships? How did they experience that? How did they feel? So we talk about these individual things throughout class and throughout this grant, and we're able to create a website so that we can share with a larger audience. So the next time that you drink coffee and you put some sugar in from a yellow and blue packet that says Domino sugar, or the next time you clean your face with a cotton ball, I hope that you think about the stories of the enslaved people like Sam and others that were on the ship of St. Paul that came through the port of Matagorda, Texas. Thank you.
Well, we've just heard from Professor Berry about the horrors of slavery and the sugary sweet delight of freedom that lured people to Mexico if they could get that far. I'm here to say that one of the sweet delights of freedom is that it is the condition under which leadership best flourishes. In fact, I don't believe that you can have genuine leadership outside of the context of freedom, and I don't believe you can have freedom without leadership. Leadership is such an important topic that I know many of us want to ask where it is that people can learn what it is they need to know in order to be leaders. Well, the University of Texas says that it is one of those places. We've been saying it for 50 years, actually. We claim that our graduates are prepared to be leaders. I'm now in the process of finishing up a book under the title The Garden of Leaders, which has as its topic this question: what is it that a university or college should be doing to prepare its students to be leaders when they graduate? And a lot of it we're already doing. I think there's more that we can do. I first became interested in this topic. I was learning about the relationship between freedom and leadership as I studied the origins of democracy in ancient Greece. And I saw that the two concepts developed hand in hand. But we don't have to go that far back. American history itself gives us some fascinating examples of leadership, of which the first and perhaps the most important is the military career of George Washington. George Washington wanted to be a commissioned officer in His Majesty's Army. That was his life goal. Thank goodness he didn't make it. He was lucky not to make it. Had he been a commissioned officer in the Royal Army, he could have commanded obedience, and those who disobeyed him could be shot. No leadership there. As it was, he commanded an army over which he had no authority of the traditional military kind. There was no government. to back him up. There was only a deadlocked Congress back in Philadelphia or running off in New Jersey. There were no rewards he could give because Congress didn't vote any money for this army. All he had to depend on was leadership itself. And this is how I understand leadership. Leadership is the ability to influence people to follow you without carrots and without sticks, when you have nothing, no authority, no way to punish people, no way to dazzle them with potential rewards, but just this one thing. And actually, the leadership that Washington had depended on the one thing he did have to offer, the one reward he did have to offer, which was the freedom that they all hoped to achieve from the British Empire. I have two episodes from the Revolutionary War that I want to tell you. The first, in the early years of the war, towards the end of 1776, Washington prepared his army for the Second Battle of Trenton. Now, you know about the famous crossing of the Delaware. That was the first one. This is the second one. Second time he crossed the Delaware, in the very last days of the year, his plan was to engage the British, which he did in a defensive battle successfully. But then he found himself in danger of being flanked, and he had to make a quick exit by night, as you may have read, around the British Army via Princeton to Morristown, where he was safe. This seemed such a miraculous survival of the army that it persuaded the French that the American army was not going to be destroyed and that the Americans might actually win the war. And that is what brought the French in. So it's really the most important operation in the war. It almost didn't happen. It almost didn't happen because most of the troops that Washington led on the second crossing had reached the expiration date on their enlistment. He went from unit to unit to persuade them to join him in this mission. That's leadership. The second episode I want to describe occurs after the war is technically over. It is now March 1783, and the Continental Army is encamped in Newburgh, New York. And there the fires of rebellion in the army are beginning to smolder because Congress, as deadlocked as it so often was then and is now, couldn't get it together to vote pay for the officers. The officers got together and they planned a military coup. They wanted to overthrow Congress, take charge themselves. They wanted to use Washington, I think, as a figurehead. And they had planned a meeting at which this would be presented to the whole officer corps at Newburgh. Washington got wind of this, and he spent 3 days writing a speech. This was the Newburgh Address. One of the few things that Washington wrote that Hamilton didn't write. Washington truly wrote this speech, put a great deal of effort into it. He surprised the audience by arriving because he'd not been invited. They were going to stage the coup and then invite him to be figurehead. He surprised them by coming in, and he surprised them in another way because they had never seen him wearing spectacles. Before he read his speech, he pulled out his spectacles and he said, "You know, I've worn myself out in your service. And now I'm almost blind in your service." And it apparently moved people to tears in the audience. And then he went on to give the address with this powerful argument that the freedom they had fought and bled for so many years would be not just compromised, but totally sacrificed if they overthrew civilian government. Military government would not be free. He won the day. He set the precedent for civilian control of the military, which we observe to this day. And as a result, the American Revolution is one of the very few that did not end in a military dictatorship. You think about that. So what was the tool that Washington used to win the troops over before the crossing of the Delaware and to win the officers over at Newburgh? It was communication, of course. It was speaking. But it wasn't just speaking. It was speaking in the context of a character that people recognized as trustworthy. He'd been working on this. At a fairly early age, he had been reading books about character and trying to develop the character that people would trust. Unluckily for him, he was born into a slave-holding culture, so he had no opportunity to practice leadership on slaves. Slaveholders have the lash, after all, and don't have any opportunity to be leaders. But Washington did have the opportunity to develop it with the Continental Army, and he had developed the tools already. Now, reflecting on this story, I'm thinking now and writing about what it is that our students should know as they prepare to be leaders. And number one, obvious from the story I've just told, is communication. They need to know how to speak and write. And today, of course, they need to know also how to use other technology to communicate, perhaps visual images as well. And second, they need to be doing what Washington was doing, thinking about what a reliable character is, thinking about what it is to be trustworthy, and how to cultivate those qualities in yourself. Ethics courses might help. And third, I think our students need to study stories like the one I just told you. This is a rare incident in which a military commander had no authority to punish people who disobeyed and no authority to promise rewards to those who did obey, aside from the freedom they all coveted. Right. So, studying that history is extremely valuable. To history, I would want to add literature, and I would want to sum this up by saying our students should come to understand as well as they can the human condition by studying literature and history. And what are these things I've just talked about? Speaking and writing, ethics, character development, history, literature. Aren't these the humanities? They're not quite enough, right? Knowing things doesn't by itself make you a leader. Obviously, you need practice. And I think any university ought to be giving students as much opportunities as it can to lead in the classroom and in organizations outside the classroom as well. I organize my students into teams in most of my classes and have them take turns being leaders. But whether they're going to be computer scientists, engineers, advertising executives, professional dancers, they need to know the things I'm talking about, because in any of those lines of work, there are opportunities for people to be leaders. In addition to giving them opportunities and knowledge, we need to give them examples. Every teacher teaches ethics. Every teacher exemplifies leadership from the podium. Maybe a good example or a bad one, but every teacher should be thinking about how to set a good example. If I'm right, freedom calls for leadership, leadership calls for education, and the education that leadership calls for is an education in the humanities. Thank you very much.